The distant boom of artillery jolted Arthur Brooks awake, the earth shuddering beneath his thin cot like a beast stirring in its sleep. In the trenches of World War I, November 1918, the air reeked of death, a rancid blend of gunpowder, rotting flesh, and damp metal that clawed its way into his lungs. The stench coated his skin, heavier than the mud caked on his boots, an inescapable rot that burrowed into his bones. Sleep was a fleeting mercy here, always shattered by rifle cracks or the ghostly whispers that haunted his dreams. Arthur couldn't recall the last time he'd rested without dread. The war's end loomed close, they said, but for him it felt like a lie. This hell would never release him. His body ached, every muscle screaming from exhaustion. His unshaven face itched under layers of grime, his uniform stiff with dirt. But it was his mind that bore the deepest scars, a battlefield of fractured memories and unshakable guilt. A chill sliced through his tattered coat, but it wasn't the cold that made his hands tremble or the hairs on his neck stand rigid. Something else twisted in his gut, something unnatural. As he rubbed sleep from his bloodshot eyes, a voice, soft, achingly familiar, cut through the darkness. Arthur. His breath froze. It couldn't be. Henry, his brother, stood beside his cot, whole and untouched. But Henry was dead. Arthur had cradled his broken body at Hill 47, felt the warmth drain from his hand as the light left his eyes. His heart slammed against his ribs, a painful thud that drowned out the distant gunfire. Arthur's mind screamed to look away, to reject this impossibility, but his eyes were locked on Henry's face, unchanged, alive. The trench seemed to warp around him, the world bending under the weight of what he saw. His shaking hands reached out, fingertips grazing only cold air where Henry stood. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He'd watched his brother die, felt the finality of it. Yet here Henry was, his presence tearing through Arthur like a blade, ripping open wounds he'd buried deep. Arthur, Henry whispered again, his voice like the creak of their childhood home in a storm. Familiar yet wrong. Arthur clutched his coat, fingers digging into the frayed fabric as if it could tether him to reality. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the vision to vanish. But when he opened them, Henry remained, his gaze piercing, unyielding. Arthur's legs betrayed him as he tried to stand, the dirt floor seeming to pull him down, hungry to swallow him whole. His mind raced, shell shock, madness, anything to explain this. But Henry's eyes held a truth that cut deeper than any hallucination. Sweat stung Arthur's forehead, cold rivulets tracing his face as the trench's decay faded, leaving only his brother's presence. "Come with me," Henry said, his voice low, urgent, pulling at something primal in Arthur's chest. He had no choice. The ache to understand, to grasp this impossibility, overpowered his fear. His boots crunched through the frozen mud, each step dragging him deeper into the trench's labyrinthine shadows. His chest tightened, breaths shallow, as he followed Henry's figure through twisting corridors that felt like a descent into madness. The air grew thicker, suffocating, his pulse a frantic drumbeat. This wasn't a dream. He felt it in the raw ache of his heart. Henry was here impossibly in this God-forsaken wasteland, and that truth didn't soothe him. It only deepened the terror. "Where are we going?" Arthur's voice cracked, barely escaping his parched throat. Henry didn't turn, his silhouette gliding ahead with an eerie calm that made Arthur's skin crawl. The night's silence pressed in, heavy and wrong, as if the world itself had tilted off its axis. They stopped at a narrow junction where the trench walls loomed closer, the stench of rot so thick it churned his stomach. Arthur gripped the muddy wall, its rough surface grounding him as his mind spun. Henry turned then, his eyes familiar yet distant, like they'd seen beyond the veil of life. "Arthur," he said softly, his voice echoing in the stillness, "you need to listen. There's something they're hiding." Arthur's pulse roared in his ears. He wanted to demand answers, but his tongue felt leaden. The air grew colder, his breath misting before him as a low, guttural moan rose from the earth itself, vibrating in his chest. Shadows stirred and figures emerged, soldiers, their faces hauntingly familiar. Men he'd fought beside, now dead. Their uniforms hung in tatters, some blood-stained, others burned or missing limbs. Silent, they watched him, their eyes hollow with accusation. Arthur's throat tightened, his legs rooted as the weight of their presence crushed him. "Who are they?" he whispered, voice lost in the oppressive quiet. "They're the ones who didn't make it." Henry said, his tone hollow, distant. Betrayed, used. Arthur swallowed, tasting rust and blood. This wasn't madness, it was real. The dead weren't just ghosts. They were messengers. The air grew colder still, his vision blurring as the faces warped, the ground shifting beneath him. Arthur, Henry's voice cut through, sharp and urgent. Wake up. They've been using us all along. The words hit like a gunshot. The war's carnage, the endless deaths, it wasn't just chaos. Something darker lurked beneath, a betrayal buried in the trenches. Arthur stumbled forward, sweat slicking his hands, the truth crashing over him like a tidal wave. He wasn't just a soldier in a war. He was caught in something far more sinister, and the realization shattered everything he thought he knew. The truth clawed at Arthur Brooks like a living thing, a jagged weight crushing his chest until each breath burned. The war wasn't about honor or sacrifice. It was a lie, orchestrated by men like General Harlow, who'd traded lives for profit. The betrayal seared through Arthur, hotter than the icy November air of 1918. The dead, those ghostly soldiers who'd haunted him in the trenches, weren't just specters of grief, they demanded justice. Their anger churned inside him, a storm threatening to tear him apart. Beside him, Victor trudged in silence, his weathered face a mask of grim resolve. He'd seen too much death, felt its cold grip too often. But even his eyes flickered with unease as they ventured deeper into the trench's shadows toward Chateau Morneau. The estate loomed ahead, its blackened silhouette stabbing into the starless sky like a monument to despair. The air thickened as they approached, the ground hardening beneath their boots, each step crunching like brittle bones. Arthur's lungs stung with every shallow breath, the cold biting deeper, as if the spirits themselves were coiling around him, their presence a frost that seeped into his soul. Arthur, Victor whispered, his voice barely cutting through the oppressive silence. You sure about this? We don't know what's waiting. Arthur's throat was too dry to answer. He wanted to reassure Victor, to sound certain, but his lips refused to move. He gave a stiff nod, his heart pounding like a war drum. The dead had led him here. There was no turning back. The rusted gates of Chateau Morneau groaned open, their creak echoing like a wail from the damned. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and decay, the corridors narrow and suffocating, shadows stretching across cracked walls like grasping hands. Each step reverberated, boots scraping against the stone floor, as if the chateau itself were alive, watching, judging. Arthur's pulse hammered, his senses razor-sharp. Whispers slithered through the dark, low, guttural, the voices of the fallen. Their rage clawed at him, urging him deeper into this new hell. The trench had been torture, but this place was a shrine to betrayal, built on the bones of men sent blindly to their deaths. Then they found them. In a dimly lit room at the chateau's heart, General Harlow and his conspirators huddled, their voices a low murmur of treachery. They spoke of a final assault, a bloodbath to prolong the war for their gain. Harlow's face was all sharp angles, his eyes glinting with soulless calculation. He didn't flinch as Arthur and Victor stepped into the flickering light, but the air shifted, growing colder, heavier. Arthur's breath misted before him, the spirit's presence tightening like a noose. Henry stood behind him, his ghostly form fading yet piercingly real, his gaze locked on Harlow with a silent fury that made Arthur's skin crawl. Harlow's eyes flicked from Victor to Arthur, cold and unyielding. You know what must be done, he said to his officers, his voice smooth as ice. The 11th. Thousands will fall, but the war ends on our terms. Arthur's blood roared, rage surging like a tidal wave. You bastard! He snarled, stepping forward, fists clenched so tight his knuckles whitened. You sold us out. You've been bleeding us dry from the start. For a fleeting moment, fear flashed in Harlow's eyes, a crack in his mask. Then the room trembled. The temperature plummeted and the dead surged in, their forms flickering like candle flames, soldiers mangled and bloodied, their eyes burning with vengeance. Victor grabbed Arthur's arm, his grip iron-hard. We have to stop this, he hissed, voice taut with urgency. It's bigger than Harlow, but Arthur barely heard him. His vision blurred, the room spinning as he faced Harlow, the man who'd orchestrated this nightmare. The spirit's anger pulsed through him, their need for justice a fire in his veins. His heart thundered, deafening as sweat slicked his palms. The air grew impossibly cold, thick with the stench of death, the walls closing in like a tomb. You sent us to die for nothing, Arthur growled, his voice raw, trembling with fury. Harlow's indifference only fueled the storm inside him. Then the dead materialized fully, an avalanche of shadows flooding the room. Their forms shimmered, tattered uniforms, missing limbs, faces burned beyond recognition. The air froze, Arthur's breath catching as their rage pressed against him, suffocating. His legs trembled, but he stood firm, the weight of their betrayal anchoring him. Henry's fading figure lingered at his side, his voice a whisper in the chaos. "They used us all." The words sliced through Arthur, sharp and final. This wasn't just a war, it was a conspiracy, a machine of greed that had devoured his brother, his comrades, and now threatened to swallow him whole. As the spirits closed in, their presence a crushing force, Arthur knew the reckoning had begun, and he was its instrument. The spirits of Arthur's fallen comrades swarmed the room, their mangled forms a tide of despair that made the chateau's walls groan, as if the building itself recoiled from their fury. Faces frozen in the agony of their deaths, torn limbs, scorched flesh, eyes burning with betrayal, locked onto General Harlow. He stood, no longer the untouchable commander, but a cornered animal, his sharp features paling under the weight of their gaze. Arthur's own rage mirrored theirs, a fire scorching his veins, but it was more than anger now. The spirits weren't just guiding him, they were part of him. Their pain and vengeance flooding his body like a storm about to shatter the world. Henry lingered in the shadows, his ghostly silhouette softer, almost mournful, yet unyielding. His presence tore at Arthur's heart, a jagged reminder of loss and purpose. His brother wasn't here just to witness justice. He was leading Arthur deeper into this reckoning. Harlow's eyes darted, a flicker of fear betraying his icy facade. Arthur didn't care. Words were useless now. Justice wasn't a debate, it was a blade, and the time to strike had come. A soldier's spirit, one Arthur recognized from a trench long buried, lunged first. His spectral hand seized Harlow's arm, ice-cold and merciless, dragging him to the room's center. Harlow's face twisted in horror, his body rigid as the spirit's grip tightened. He tried to scream, but the air thickened, charged with the dead's power, choking his voice. The room crackled, snaps of bone, echoes of screams silenced by war, each sound a knife in Arthur's chest. He stepped forward, his voice lost in the chaos, the cold biting so deep it numbed his soul. The spirit's rage surged through him, a wildfire in his blood. But beneath it, a mournful wail for all they'd lost held him captive. Harlow's body jerked, his skin turning ashen, his hands clawing at his throat as if he could tear air from the spirit's grasp. His eyes bulged, mouth gaping in a silent scream. Arthur's hands trembled, his body quaking as he fought to stay anchored, to remain human. The spirit's vengeance was righteous, but it was also something darker, unstoppable, consuming. They weren't just punishing Harlow. They were swallowing everything. "Stop!" Arthur's whisper was a desperate breath, but the dead were beyond reason, their chorus of pain and fury drowning him. He felt himself slipping, merging with their wrath, the line between man and ghost blurring. Harlow collapsed, a twitching husk on the stone floor, his face locked in a grimace of terror. The spirits had claimed their due, but the cost hung heavy. Arthur stared at his trembling hands, no longer certain they were his own. He wasn't the man who'd entered this chateau. He was something else, alive yet tethered to the dead. The spirits began to fade, their anger spent, their forms dissolving into the shadows. The room's oppressive cold eased, but Arthur stood frozen, the weight of what he'd unleashed sinking into his bones. Harlow's lifeless body sprawled before him, a broken shell of the man who'd betrayed them all. Arthur had come to stop a massacre, to expose the conspiracy that bled his comrades dry. But as silence smothered the room, no relief came, only a hollow ache. The dead were avenged, but the war's shadow lingered. Had he stopped anything, or had he merely become a vessel for their rage? The cold still clung to him, not from the air, but from the truth. He'd joined the spirits, their fury now a part of him, pulsing in his veins. Nothing would ever be the same. The spirit's rage lingered in Arthur Brooks like a second heartbeat, an indelible echo woven into his soul. The chateau's shadowed room felt colder now, its darkness stretching like claws across the stone floor. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one tight with the crushing weight of what he'd done, what he'd become. The bodies of his fallen comrades, their faces frozen in eternal pain, seemed to watch him from the corners of his vision. They were at peace, their vengeance fulfilled, But Arthur's soul was a battlefield still, torn between the living and the dead. Victor stood beside him, his face pale, eyes hollowed by the same horror gripping Arthur's heart. His hand rested on Arthur's shoulder, heavy as centuries of grief. "You did what you had to," Victor murmured, his voice unsteady, as if he didn't believe his own words. Arthur's throat tightened, words choked by the bitter taste of betrayal and loss. He'd followed the spirit's wrath into this place, let their fury steer him, but now doubt gnawed at him. Was it worth it? The war was over, the armistice signed, but for Arthur, a darker war had begun, one that would haunt him forever. He was no longer just a soldier. He was bound to the dead, their world bleeding into his own. Victor's gaze lingered, heavy with unspoken truth. They both knew there was no going back, no reclaiming the men they'd been before the ghosts, before the sacrifice. As they stepped out of the chateau, dawn broke, its pale light slicing through the battlefield's scars. Yet the warmth couldn't touch the chill rooted deep in Arthur's bones. The ghosts clung to him, their presence a weight that no sunrise could lift. He didn't look back at the estate, couldn't bear to. The creak of its gates, the whispers of the dead, they'd stay with him always. The world stirred faintly. Birds called in the distance, the murmur of life creeping back. But Arthur felt only silence, a void louder than any cannon. Part of him had died in that chateau, left behind with the spirit's rage and Henry's fading eyes. Victor walked beside him, his steps heavy, each carrying the same burden. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and war's lingering rot. Arthur tried to shake the image of Harlow's ashen corpse, its grimace seared into his mind, but it clung like damp mud. Justice hadn't filled the emptiness inside him. It had carved it deeper. The spirit's sorrow and anger pulsed just beyond his senses, a constant shadow. And the worst part? He wasn't sure he wanted them gone. They'd shown him the truth, the betrayal, the greed, the blood spilled for nothing. They'd made him part of something greater, something terrible. At the battlefield's edge, Arthur paused, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage, shattered rifles, torn earth, relics of a war that had stolen everything. His heart thudded, heavy with the weight of it all. "I won't forget them," he said, voice low but resolute. "I can't." Victor nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where dawn's light fought the lingering dark. "Neither will I." A soft breeze stirred, carrying whispers of the fallen, their voices weaving through the air like a final lament. Arthur understood then. The dead were no longer just ghosts. They were his truth, the price of survival. As sunlight bathed the scarred land, he knew some battles never ended. Some ghosts never faded, and he would carry them, Henry, the soldiers, the betrayal, until his last breath.